Hi, my name is Chris Chen. I'm the Executive Director for Asset Management Ontario. We're a community of practice of municipal asset management practitioners. And what that entails is that municipal staff, municipal practitioners share information and effective practices with each other to help them on their asset management journeys. One area where a lot of municipalities struggle is in setting and implementing levels of service. This is part of OREG 588-17. And, and so we have Mayuri Bharkhada, who's a very experienced asset manager at the region of Peel, here to answer some questions. And Mayuri works with a bunch of different municipalities across Ontario, and so has good insights on this. Hi, Mayuri.
Hi there. Thank you for having me here.
I just wanted to ask you, so what are levels of service and why are they important?
So level of service is basically amount of output from a service against which performance can be measured. They're basically, I would say, indicators that relate the asset performance to a municipality's service objective. Now, levels of service can be defined at a service level, which we call them as community levels of service or customer levels of service, or at an asset level, which we call it as asset levels of service. So let me explain what community or customer levels of service are. These are basically statements that describe what a customer is expecting from the service, and they're usually non-technical measures. So an example, as a resident, I would like the roads to be safe and accessible year-round and during all weather conditions. Another example that I have is, as a resident, I would like reliable water supply. As soon as I open my tap, I want that water flowing from it. So these are basically statements. They're non-technical measures. These are called community or customer levels of service. Now, because they're non-technical measure, we have asset or technical levels of service that actually measure the ability of the assets to provide services to meet our customer or our service objectives. So these asset levels of service are now called our targets. These are targets that we need to achieve or meet our customer levels of service. Now, these asset levels of service are further broken down into two measures. One of them is condition measure. So this condition measures the physical health of an asset, and they can be described or addressed through capital projects to replace or rehabilitate assets. So when you look at your capital plan, if you see projects to replace or rehabilitate or reconstruct, these are basically measures that we are trying to fix on the condition side. An example I would give is an asset level of service for a road would be a pavement condition index of 72. Now, this means or translate into that we want our pavement to be in a good condition. And that's why we're fixing condition index of 72, identifying that as good. Now, the other example I have is a maximum one break for a segment of pipe, a water segment of pipe. So this basically translates into replace your segment when it is anticipated to reach one break. So these are our targets. These are now what we call our goals. We need to achieve these goals to be able to provide that customer satisfaction, what the customer is expecting. So these are our targets. These are our condition targets. They talk about the physical health of the asset. Now, the other measure that we have is performance. Performance basically measures capacity, redundancy, or backup. What we want is we want to make sure that if there is an asset failure, do we have redundancy? Do we have backup to continue our operations? So when you look at your capital plan, if you see capital projects to upgrade, add, or reconfigure, these projects are basically for the issues that we have on the performance side of the assets. So an example I would have is capacity to meet demand. So for example, for transportation side or for the pavement, do we have sufficient number of lanes along each road segment to accommodate peak traffic volumes? Another example I have is maintain a pressure of 40 psi during peak hour demand periods. So to be able to provide that customer or the community level of service having safe road, we need to make sure that we have good enough or sufficient number of lanes. To be able to have reliable water supply, we need to make sure there is enough pressure in those pipes as well. Now, something that I want to clarify here is a lot of municipalities look into condition measures only, but what we are suggesting is look at the performance measure as well. For example, we can have a water main pipe servicing a residential area, let's say. Now, the condition of that pipe is excellent. No breaks, nothing wrong with it. But it is not performing. Why? Because that water main that it's servicing that area, we need a bigger pipe. Right now, that pipe is 400, let's say 400 diameter, 400 millimeter diameter. Now, what we want is a bigger pipe to service that area. So we need a bigger capacity of pipe. So this is where we identify that there's issues in this asset. Condition is excellent, but we have issues on the performance side. The capacity is not enough. And that's why we need to make sure that we have performance measures as well. Now, why do we have this level of service? Why are they important? Levels of service are foundation, or I would say a basis for asset management planning and decision making. They set the target for our desired state. It identifies underperforming asset. It informs on the asset improvements to achieve our service objective, and also sustainable service delivery. By planning proactively, there will be cost saving. For example, a road that required a resurfacing, now if it got delayed for another few years, that road will no longer require a resurface, but it will require reconstruction. Therefore, now it's going to cost us more. So having these levels of service helps us to plan proactively, reduce our costs. This will ultimately help the residents as well, because this is coming out from their taxes. It also measures the state of the infrastructure. It identifies the gaps between our current state and our desired state of asset. It also identifies infrastructure funding gap. So comparison between what the current funding levels is and the funding required to meet our asset level of service target. That's why it's very important to have these levels of service. There are targets. Until you don't have those targets, you don't know where you're sitting currently, what state you're sitting currently, where do you want to go? Are you even achieving your customer's expectation? All this can only be done if you have your levels of service. That's why we call it as levels of service are a foundation to your asset management.
Thank you, Mayuri. What challenges do you commonly see among municipalities that struggle to establish and implement levels of service?
First and foremost, I would say it's understanding what level of service is. Majority of the time, municipalities are confused between what a level of service is and what a key performance indicator is. These two words are interchangeably used when there is vast difference between the two. There is also confusion between the operations and maintenance levels of service and capital levels of service. There is also confusion between service levels that are reported on FIR, which are basically KPIs, and also the asset levels of service. A lot of municipalities are taking service levels from the FIR and putting them as levels of service when they're not, they're KPIs. Some of these service levels are not even related to the assets. And what we usually recommend is talk to other municipalities, talk to your neighboring municipalities, ask them what their level of service framework is, how they define their levels of service. Talk to them, understand what their process was, learn from them, but don't just take their level of service framework or their level of service hierarchy and start using it for your own municipality, because each municipality is very different. And I have seen that. If one municipality's target, let's say for roads, is a PCI of 72, to keep their condition of the roads at 72, another municipality, they can't just take it and have that as their target. They need to cater those to their own municipalities. Funding levels would be very different for each municipality. Having a PCI 72 means that they have that kind of funding levels. Now, if your municipality can't have those funding levels, they can't afford to have it, your level of service need to reduce. So make sure that, talk to other people, but then don't just take and copy those. Cater them to your own municipality. Another thing that I've found is that a lot of times levels of service are defined or set in isolation without the involvement of other departments that have knowledge about the assets. For example, operations and maintenance people, capital, finance, these people touch those assets, especially the operations and maintenance people. They touch these assets all the time. Have these departments at the table. This will help you better define your asset levels of service. There'll be good discussions. There could be asset levels of service that can be identified from there, which are really not telling you any stories. So these ops and maintenance people, the capital people, that will help you further, whether these levels of service make sense or not. So have all those people at the table when defining the levels of service. I have seen a lot of time where finance people have gone and they have actually identified the levels of service. That's not how we do it. Another important concept that misses out in here is the line of sight. There should be a connection between community needs and the asset requirements. And that's why we need to make sure we have that level of service hierarchy, which I haven't seen in a lot of municipalities. Start off by having that level of service hierarchy. This will give you the line of sight by itself. Take your service. What is the customer level of service? What is this customer expecting from our service? What are the assets that are providing those service? And then set your asset levels of service. It will be very easy to identify the levels of service like that. So line of sight is also very important to keep in mind when we are setting levels of service.
In terms of just a point of clarification, why are levels of service not the same as key performance indicators?
So I would say level of service, take it as a standard. It's a standard. Whereas KPI measures the level of conformance to that standard. So maybe if I give some examples, it will make it more clear. So let's say for an asset level of service, we have an example here for stormwater sewers. Our asset level of service or our target for storm sewers is to keep these sewers in a good condition. So our target would be to maintain the condition grade of level 3 for these storm sewers. So that's our asset level of service, keeping the condition of level 3. Now a KPI would be percentage of storm sewer assets that are in good or very good condition. So it's trying to confirm how many of those assets are in good condition. Our target is to keep all those storm sewers in a good condition. KPI is just confirm how many of those sewers are in good or very good condition. Another example would be stormwater management facilities, so the storm ponds. They need to meet Ontario's 5% total suspended solid reduction requirement. That is our asset level of service. It's regulated, basically. The KPI would be the percentage of stormwater management facilities that meet that criteria or that regulated level of service. So that's the difference. Asset level of service is your standard, whereas a KPI is just a confirmation of, are we doing what we say that our target is? It's just a level of conformance to that standard.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Mary.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any general words of advice, just based on your experience, about for municipalities to succeed in setting their levels of service?
I would say when you start creating your levels of service or start setting or defining them, start off by creating a line of sight, the connection from your service being provided to the actual assets that provide those services. This will make it very easy to create the levels of service for each of the asset class that are identified. Use the asset hierarchy, use the level of service hierarchy. The other thing that I would suggest is asset management is multidisciplinary and it impacts all levels of the organization. Therefore, involve as many departments as possible that are heavily involved in managing physical assets when you're setting the levels of service. They will really help you out. They have a lot more knowledge in setting those levels of service, a lot more knowledge on the assets themselves. Also, start off by adding the regulatory asset levels of service first. They're right there. We already have some from the provisional regulation. Have them in there first, and then add your additional ones and the relevant asset level of service. And we always need to make sure that we don't overcomplicate these levels of service. Keep them simple and minimize the number. As you go through setting the levels of service, keep on questioning, why do you need that level of service? What does it tell you about the asset? There is no need to have so many levels of service when they don't tell you any story about the service nor the asset themselves. And also make sure that whatever levels of service that you're setting, you have data to measure them. There is no point in having levels of service set, but you don't have data unless you know. And that's why it's very important that we have all these other departments at the table, because maybe you are not collecting them right now. But now that you've set that level of service, they can tell you right there and there, yes, we can collect that extra data. There is no problem. So sometimes, it's helpful that when we have all these people at the table, first, defining the level of service would be easier. And again, to make sure that we collect the data to measure these asset levels of service. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is when you are grouping assets into asset classes, the asset levels of service that you define or set, they should be applicable to each and every asset in an asset class. So what I mean by that is, let's say we have storm sewer as an asset class. If the asset level of service is to maintain the condition at a level 3, then this target of maintaining to level 3 applies to each and every storm sewer in that asset class. You cannot have different levels of service for different assets within an asset class. And then a key point that we really need to remember is when you set the asset level of service, make sure there is a balance between risk, cost, and the level of service being provided. If you set your levels of service high, your service will be improved, there will be reduction in risk, but to maintain that high level of asset, it's going to cost you a lot. To maintain that level, it will be very costly. And this will ultimately impact the customers or the residents through the tax increases, which they will not like it. The other point is, if you set them too low, this reduces the service, it increases the risk, but it is easy to sustain and less costly to maintain. Therefore, we need to make sure that when we set the targets, those targets should be maintained in such a way that they balance the risk, cost, and the level of service that we are providing.
Thank you very much. That's really helpful, Mary. Really appreciate your insights on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just wanted to make one more point, that setting the levels of service, defining them, the templates, the level of service hierarchy, all these important information is actually quite readily available on Asset Management Ontario's website. So I would literally want everybody, or recommend everybody, to visit Asset Management Ontario website, where they will be able to find details about levels of service, how they're defined, how the templates work, the levels of service hierarchy, which is the line of sight that I was talking about. All that information is available on Asset Management Ontario's website. They can go through the webinar series or guides and templates. This will really help them out.